Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all. Thanks for joining today's webinar session. It is going to be a great webinar today for the instructional designers, LMS administrators, managers or team leads who are looking to evaluate their team's learning by creating an effective online assessment. My name is Manish Gupta. I will be your moderator today, and I'm joined here with two experts, Brian Rush and Ajay Upadhyay, who will be basically walking us through today's session to us. So, a quick housekeeping. If you have any questions during this session, feel free to ask them through the question panel on your GoToWebinar, or you can ask the question. We have a Q&A session in the later. You can ask at that point of time. So we'll try to answer them as the question comes. Otherwise, we'll do towards the later part. You can also post your questions to the users community at EduBrite University site. So now here's a quick agenda for today's discussion. So oftentimes you may have wondered that what is the difference between a quiz and a test, survey, or exam, and what are the best ways of using them? What are the different question types available? What are the best practices of using the question types? How can you collect the learning data and you can analyze that? So in today's session, you will get a tip on creating the effective online assessment using different question types and using the different methods available to leverage those question types. You will also learn about the various types of assessment, the terminology, and what is the right format and when to use it. So we'll take a deeper dive in this. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our expert, Brian. So Brian, you can continue.
Thank you, Manish. Appreciate the introduction and handoff. The thing we're going to talk about first is the various question types that are used in an online assessment. The question types that are offered in some of the authoring tools and in LMSs are not limited to these necessarily, but these are the most popular ones. You'll see on the left that the Captivate one has a number of question types, and then there's selections for each one where you can choose between graded and survey. And then these two over here on the far right are for Articulate. The blue ones are graded and the green ones are survey questions. So you'll notice that they're pretty much the same. We've got hotspot in both. We've got matching. The Articulate has a little bit more in the drag and drop category, whereas the matching is more menu based in Captivate. But as you'll see, they're very similar. So the first one we're going to talk about is the most popular, and most of these are pretty self-explanatory, but the multiple choice question is where the learner selects one or more correct answers from a list of entries. So in Articulates, they have the multiple choice as a question type as well as multiple response. Whereas in Captivate, it's a multiple choice, and then you configure it. Once you've made that question, you can configure it as a multiple choice or multiple select. And then matching is where the learner matches the entry in two lists. The user interface can vary on these. It might be a drag and drop interface or an indexed list whereby the learner chooses the corresponding letter that is keyed to the other column choice. It's best not to necessarily have a one-to-one with the choices, but instead have the distractors in the column be more than the number on the left in the left column. The drag and drop capability requires HTML5 ready browsers, and it also is something you have to be careful for when you're considering your mobile audience. Screen real estate may not be enough to get too many choices on, or the user interface is so cramped that you can't get your finger on the right button necessarily. The next one we have is the hotspot. This is where there's an image and a learner has to click a specific area within that image. A typical use case for this is a map, but it can be used to have the learner identify other things such as controls. Sequencing is pretty obvious, but that's when the learner arranges the listed items in their correct order. This is useful for assessing learner's knowledge of ordered steps of the procedure or a process. Again, it may be a drag and drop interface or an indexed list, whereby the learner chooses a number in a menu next to a choice to indicate the order numerically. Fill in the blank. The learner completes a blank in a sentence or a phrase. If there's more than one possible answer, be sure to include all options and uncheck for capitalization so that it doesn't require both the lowercase and capitalized version of the word. Also, where applicable, use a numeric fill in the blank question. You'll see one over here for articulate, but the fill in the blank for captivate is only text. And I'm going to share with you guys on the future slide here what we have to do in order to avoid certain situations. The numeric requires the user to enter the correct numeric value, whether a single number, a range of numbers, or any combination thereof. That would be for math-based questions. Likert, short answer rather, is where the learner inputs a word or phrase. This is similar to fill in the blank, but has a larger character count field for it to allow more text. And true, false, learner chooses either true or false there, pretty obvious. Likert is more of a survey question. That's where the learner chooses a rating on a scale. In authoring tools, it's sometimes beneficial to add multiple ratings in a matrix rather than having one on each question slide so that you can keep the theme and the scale the same. Essay is where the learner inputs longer text or uploads a document. This can't be graded naturally automatically. You'll see the essay question available here as a survey, but really that's just an open text question for surveys. There's no essay question available in the graded versions of either of these. Word bank, you might notice over here, is similar to multiple choice question in its exclusivity, mutual exclusivity, but it's essentially a multiple choice in menu format rather than having all the choices listed out. And this is good for when you have limited screen real estate. So we're going to talk about multiple choice questions a little bit more here. So I want to get us all on the same page with the anatomy of a multiple choice question. The question itself is referred to as the stem or the root. This is the stem, and this is passive, and it's just something that the learner is being asked. And then the various choices that are available for, either a multiple choice or a multiple select question are called the distractors. These choices are the ones that the instructional designer has written to fool the learner into thinking are the actual one if they don't know. And then the key is actually the answer itself. So we've got the stem, the distractors, and the key. So that's the anatomy of a multiple choice question. This particular one that you're seeing here is a multiple choice, as evidenced by the radio buttons here, whereas a multiple select question would have checkboxes and require multiple answers checked. Multiple choice questions are the most widely used question type, and they're also something that you have to be very careful of when you're writing them to make sure that you've talked to that question in your content and that that content supports it. There's a certain art form in writing good distractors, but the main thing is to align the question with the learning objective. Create plausible, credible distractors. So don't make it obvious that a choice is incorrect, partly due to its not making grammatical sense with the stem and not having the right subject-verb agreement, for example. You want to avoid not. So which of these is not an adjective? You also want to avoid none of the above. That's not something you want to do, is present a bunch of choices to somebody and ask them to pick one or more, and none of them are correct. That would fall under deception in my book. If you wanted to do a none of the above type answer, you could use a fill in the blank instead, and that way you'd be measuring their recall that way. This is not a test in logic, so don't require the mental overhead to interpret the question. Don't make it hard for them to figure out what you're asking. Avoid none of the above, we said. If you have a multiple select question, it's best to specify the number of correct choices. They might think it's more than one, more than the two that you really are requiring, and pick another one just because it looks really good. But again, we're not testing them on how well they take tests. We're testing them on what they know and what they can recall. In a multiple select and multiple choice, it's best to shuffle the choices. You might have a question with all of the above, or but you can, in most authoring tools, you can specify that the last choice is left as last, and the rest are shuffled above. You don't want to minimize, you don't want to actually randomize the true-false questions, and it's probably a best practice to keep a sequence of numbers in their numeric order rather than scrambling them up. So if you have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, I might just leave those alone. At this point, I'd like to also mention that we have a blog, blog.edubrite.com, where we have our current blog post is on the do's and don'ts of effective e-learning questions. And anybody who wants to learn more about writing effective multiple choice questions, or any type of questions rather for online assessments, is encouraged to visit that site, blog.edubrite.com. So it's time to take a quiz. This is a multiple choice question. And I'm going to ask here, what is at issue with this question composition? Go ahead and type into the chat box here. And while you're doing that, I'm going to point out a couple of things. You'll notice that I'm asking, when does this occur? And that these are all days, measurements of days. And I also have from exposure, from exposure, from exposure. So anybody want to take a shot at what's wrong with this question in that perspective? I'm seeing a couple of posts come in. What I'm trying to say here is that if we've got about 7 days from exposure, 1 day from exposure, why not build that from exposure into the stem? So if instead we ask, how many days from the time of exposure does the onset of flu symptoms begin? Then we've taken out the about, and we've taken out days, and we've taken out from exposure, so that we can get to the real meat of the choices. So then our choices would be about X days. Likewise, since we asked for the number of days, we don't need that in each choice either. For even better efficacy measurement, we could make this into a numeric fill in the blank. That way we're actually testing the recall and not the recognition of the learner's test taking skills. So just ask for 7, 1, 5, or 2 instead of these choices. So additionally, we have here an outstanding example of one choice being significantly longer than the rest. As a test taker, if you're not sure of the answer, you can bet on the longest one. Furthermore, this longer answer uses the choice to teach by refining the answer with the range of days. So it's teaching with the test. So it's best to make all the choices as a range of days and stay consistent with this. So that's something you could use like this would be fine for a self-check question, but not where you are actually assessing the learner. True-false questions. Again, type in the chat box with your answer for this one. I really discourage the use of binary true-false or yes-no questions, but here goes. Okay. A true-false question is really just a non-shuffled two-choice variant of the multiple choice question type with a 50% chance of being answered correctly simply by guessing and a 73% likelihood of being true. I'm seeing a flood of answers on this one. Yep, most everybody's getting this right. It is, in fact, true. And looks like most of you got this one. It's a freebie. So here I'm obviously trying to say satirically that it's best not to use true-false questions. They're gimmies, and they're not really a truly effective way of measuring somebody's comprehension and retention of knowledge. Let's talk about online assessments next. First, we're going to talk about learning objectives. Learning objectives from an LMS perspective are the intended result of a training topic's knowledge transfer, and they're considered the lowest level of granularity of content. The objective might be met by a single SCO in a SCORM learning course, e-learning course, or content associated with a learning objective in a suitable learning management system. Assessment questions are often tightly coupled with learning objectives. One or many questions may be associated with an objective, but it's important to correlate the questions directly with the supporting content. So here we have a SCO or a lesson with some content in it of three lessons, for example, and the assessment has a number of questions. These questions and this content need to be correlated so that we're asking the right questions for what we've presented in our content. Also, it's a good practice, whether it's within the course content itself, a spreadsheet, or a database, to keep assessment questions associated with their objectives. This comes into play especially when you're revising content, as well as when pooling or banking questions. Now that we understand our learning objectives, let's standardize on the nomenclature for the sake of this discussion. With training content, there are various levels of granularity. Likewise, there are varying degrees of formality with assessments. As we said in the last slide, both of these are based on learning objectives. So with lessons, for example, we could have a quiz. Each level of assessment is higher in stakes. This one is a course, so we're calling it a test. And then if we have a certification, that's when we have an exam. So each level being higher, it requires more rigor on the part of the instructional designer and the developer to write effective questions relative to the objective, choosing the most appropriate type for it. I'll give you an example here. In a hospital where there's a surgery robot, where we were teaching the assistant that's setting up to have a certain orientation for the patient cart relative to the robotic surgery system. And instead of asking for a number like minus 20 degrees or 20 degrees or 40 or 45 or minus 45, we had the learner rotate the actual patient cart, and that was the nearest that we could do to replicate the actual being in the room and setting it up properly. So again, not necessarily guessing. So that's the formality versus granularity here. Going through these assessment types a little bit more, the exam, like I said, is usually based for a certification. It's often a standalone assessment. It's certainly reported and scored and doesn't necessarily affect navigation. It's very comprehensive. Its questions may derive from many learning objectives and can draw from many pools of questions. So this is more for higher stakes assessments. A test might be at the course level, as we mentioned. It again is reported and scored. It might affect navigation if it's part of a larger program and you have to complete that course before moving forward into the next course within it. Answers and remediation are not shown in either of these two, as multiple attempts may be allowed, and we don't necessarily want them to be shown the right answer or remediate why their choice was not the correct answer. A quiz is often associated at the lesson level. It could be within a module or a topic, and this one will often control the progression within inside of a course. Self-checks are not graded and reported, so they're often within the content itself, within the lesson. They're used to reinforce learning and can have feedback and remediation on the correct and incorrect answers. Surveys, of course, are not graded. They're more for information gathering and for learner feedback and getting reporting in aggregate on certain level 1 Kirkpatrick surveys. They can also be used to affect branching within a course or an assessment if you have a rating system that you want to have the learner give their own opinion of where they're at with certain things and then send them down the right path based on that. Question pools. Question pools are lots of questions or banks of questions. Usually they're tied to a learning objective. So with this blue one here, we've got 10 questions associated with learning objective 1. And we might have an assessment with a random draw of 5 of those questions. Likewise, this one has 8 questions for learning objective 2, and we might pull 3 of them. And then this one, oops, beg your pardon. This last one, bear with me here, is has 5 questions and is pulling 2 of them. So a pool can contain questions pertaining to particular learning objectives. The assessments can randomly draw all or any subset of them. The questions are not necessarily grouped by their pool like you're seeing here. They can be randomly spread throughout, so they don't have to be grouped by their pool learning objective. These are particularly beneficial for higher stakes tests or exams. There's times when certain questions must be part of the draw, and some systems allow for locking in or anchoring a question within a pool. Otherwise, a separate pool can be created for the critical questions, in which 100% of them are always drawn. If there are questions that build on one another and there's potential to reveal an answer in the first view, you can enforce the order of the questions. This is good for scenario-based questions as well, where they require their own section or pool. So pretests, this is when we need to assess the learner's knowledge of the content in advance of its consumption. So the learner typically takes a pretest, then takes the course, and then takes the post-test. This is useful for determining the course's learning effectiveness. Using pre and post tests provide the instructional designer with immediate level 2 Kirkpatrick training impact analysis data. Level 2 of the Kirkpatrick training evaluation model is designed to measure the extent to which the training program participants have improved their knowledge and skills as a result of the training. The pre and post tests may randomly draw from a set of pools of questions so as to serve up different ones in each attempt. So the instructional designer and developer need to make sure that there are relevant questions for each learning objective. This also may allow learner to test out of taking a course. If their passing score is high enough that it's deemed that they know the content and don't need to take the course, a predefined process can be selected instead, so that if the learner is demonstrated their knowledge and passed a certain threshold, they can get tested out of it and be marked as complete. Similarly, with branching, similar in concept to pretests, assessment outcomes can be the basis for branching learners to other content or other assessments based on their input and the resulting score. So here you can see this assessment or Likert matrix. The score and its threshold are going to determine which track this learner is going to go down here. A common use case, depending on the formality and the authoring tool, is to use the survey or the assessment to determine the learner's experience, skill level, or expertise within certain areas, and thereby place them to the appropriate point in the course, whether by track, module, lesson, or slide number. Likewise, the outcome may be used to present the appropriate level of questions in the future assessment. So next, what I'd like to do is show you in Captivate how we've got a certain quiz already created here. This quiz has 10 questions within it, and each one has the various question types that we've just talked about. So what I'm going to talk to first here is the question, the quiz preferences. So with the quiz preferences, you are usually looking at reporting first. And here we're going to be reporting to a standard LMS. We're going to use SCORM 2004, and we're going to configure it to use the 4th edition of SCORM 2004. And then we've got our SCO names here and our course names. We've got, with SCORM 2004, 2 variables to satisfy: the completion and the success. So for completion, in this particular example, I'm saying somebody has completed it if they've attempted it. Somebody has successfully completed it if they've passed it. We're not concerned about slide views in this case, since each slide is actually a question anyway. And we want to report the interaction data here so that we can get more granular information from our LMS. And additionally, our settings are such that we want to shuffle the choices, as we mentioned earlier. We can give them all the controls from a navigational perspective. Branch awares if you're doing branching. This particular one is not, but we saw branching on that last slide where you're having a learner navigate a certain path or a certain set of slides based on an outcome. Showing the progress, whether relative or absolute, allowing backward movement, and then showing the results slide and reviewing the quiz. This pass or fail is where we determine the threshold for passing, 80% in this case. We could use points instead, and it would just be 8. There is a survey question in here that has 0 points, and that's not counted in here, so you're convinced to be. In this case, we can determine what happens next after the learner completes the quiz on a passing grade. They can do any of these jumps or execute JavaScript or advanced actions, things like that. Likewise, same options are available from a failure perspective. If you wanted to open another project and send them down the road to something that needs to remediate them, you could do that. Likewise, when you're looking at the project, you can look at the start and end here. And so at the end of the project, you can say stop project. But that's pretty much it for the preferences at this point. So next, what we would do is publish this course and publish it. It would produce a zip file. The zip file would then be available to upload to the LMS. So here we are in EduBrite. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger for everybody to see. And then here you'll see that we have this same demo name, and then this is the SCORM course itself. So this SCORM course, when I click it here, is going to show the SCO and the course name. And then we have the Captivate question types and the Captivate question type SCO. So this has been already scheduled, and I'm going to assume the role of a learner next. So in this particular window, this learner is going to take this question or this assessment right now. So here we go with question number 1. This is the launch of the actual assessment itself. So click here, and then we have our opening slide. So first one is a true/false question. In Captivate and Articulate, you don't have to worry about randomization here. That's already like its own question type. In some LMSs or in other authoring tools, it's essentially a multiple choice question, and it might have the opportunity to be randomized. You want to make sure that it's not, because again, we're not testing their taking skills, we're testing their knowledge here. So I've answered false on this one. I'm going to submit. Got that one right. So this one with mutually exclusive choices is a multiple choice. So you're seeing the radio buttons here. We've got some distractors available to catch them off guard if they don't know that. And then this is a matching question to test your Silicon Valley executive company knowledge. So Satya is with Microsoft. So even though these have been shuffled, that one happens to be straight across, likewise with this one. Sundar is with Google. So this one is D, and then Meg Whitman is with eBay. So you're able to shuffle these questions, or one of these on the left inside of Captivate, and I'm sure with Articulate as well. And then this next question is our multiple select. I guess I gave that one away because I even put the label of it up here. Multiple select, and I've heard multiple guess before, but I don't consider that to be it. And likewise with multiple correct, I'd say multiple response and multiple select here. And notice that we've told the learner to choose two, because I don't want to try and trick them and say that multiple correct might be another one. I want them to choose it without any nebulous guessing going on. So I'll submit that. This is in Captivate, as I mentioned earlier on the question type slide. This one is a text. So in this case, I can put fill in the blank. I could put capital fill in the blank. I could put blanks, because I've put those various choices in the acceptable answers in the question. And I've also said to ignore case, so it doesn't matter if it's capitalized or not. So this one is going to go ahead and say correct, even though blank is probably the one I originally put there, but I wanted to make sure that I had some fail-safe thing going on here. This is the numeric one I had mentioned. So in this case, the number of days in February in a leap year. This one is going to allow me to put in any text that I want or any numbers that I want. So in this case, I could say 29. I don't know what the likelihood is of that happening for a learner to spell it out that way. But since it's not forcing a number with a numeric data type, I had to consider the various text possibilities for this as well. So 29 in this case is correct. You could have put the numeral 29 as well. Which one of these is correct? As we said, the longest one is usually it. And since I'm trying to teach with the test, I'm explaining it here. I'm going to see that that's easily this one. And go ahead and proceed with the next one. In this case, I've got a multiple choice here, and I say, I can see that we have an all of the above. And I know from my experience that A and B happen to be something I know are in fact true. So right away, I'm able to say, I don't know what C and D are, but I can say that this is an all of the above. So take care when you're making your questions to do this. If you wanted to do something differently than all of the above, make a multiple select and add more distractors instead. So I got that one right too. Now, this one is a arrangement. This is the sequencing. So we can get this one wrong because I don't feel like dragging and dropping each of these right here for our demonstration, but I'm going to say that one's incorrect. And then this is a hotspot. So in this one, we have an iPhone where there's no names underneath of the icons for the applications, and we want them to identify which one of these is the Find iPhone app. I think it might be this one, but that's got two people on it, so it might be Find My Friends. So I'm thinking it's more of this one, but I better clear that first one first. And I'm going to click on this one now. And I'm mesmerized by this animation, but I'm going to go ahead and click Submit. And I got that one right. So again, that's just to check what your knowledge is of certain areas of an image. In this case, we have a matching. This one's a little bit different, where you'll see there's more companies than there are executives. Many of the companies here have, or many of the executives rather, have more than one company that they're in charge of or that they own. And they seem to like the space ones too. So we've got SpaceX here, that belongs to Elon, and he's D. We've got Blue Origin is another space one for Jeff. Oops, he's C. And then Tesla is Elon as well. He's D. Facebook, we all know, is Mark. Instagram is Mark. Amazon is Jeff. And Whole Foods is Jeff. WhatsApp, with its spyware installation, not sure if that's going to continue to be around, but for now it is Mark Zuckerberg. Notice that Tim and Satya have none here. We don't have to connect them. We could have mentioned how many executives we wanted to in the stem here, but I didn't. So that one is the matching with the key. So rather than the drag and drop that Articulate has. And then this is a matrix of the Likert scale. So we've got a kind of a glass door question here where we've got ratings for culture, leadership, potential benefits and perks. Normally, of course, this would not be part of an assessment, but it might be the level 1 evaluation of the course. So I'm submitting this now. And since we had an 80% threshold for the score, and I got the one wrong, we're showing 90% here. You're seeing that the correct number of questions was 11 out of 12. The Likert was ungraded, and the hotspot was ungraded. I didn't get a grade for that, so that we could compare. So this one, I'm just going to exit out of it right now. I've passed the quiz. So now what we can do is go to the LMS. So this user demo one that we just took, what we can do, we can see we've completed it under the progress, and then the success status is passed. It took us 8 minutes and 10 seconds, seemed longer. And then we also have the interactions. If you recall the quiz settings, we click that checkbox for interactions. And thus we've gotten sent all of these pertinent information for the choices that we made as a learner. So you'll see the responses that we made here, false, multiple choice, things like that. A concatenation of the various sequencing and matching choices that we made. And you can see that we got this one wrong. Ideally, you can look at these for each one of the activity attempts for all of the users, but ideally you'd really want to look at them in aggregate. And EduBrite offers a unique report, aggregate report, that is compilation essentially of all of the question responses for this particular CP quiz demo. So here you're seeing most people, 6 out of 8 had said false for this one. Most people are pretty sure that Pluto is not the largest planet, and they most know what a multiple choice is. The 29, we actually have all of them as correct, because A, B, and C are all the 29. So these were the ones that we had in Captivate that we actually said are acceptable answers. As you can see down here, we've got most people answering all of the above, and these are the various permutations of the sequencing question, what order they could be in. And these are the ones that people got right for the matching, and so on. And then the Likert questions are all part of that as well. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to AJ, and he's going to show you how we can create an assessment directly inside of EduBrite.
Thanks, Brian. Right. Thanks for pretty detailed coverage about the SCORM assessments. So I know this is a series on webinar series we are doing on SCORM as a key focus, but I'll take maybe 10 minutes in this session and show you a couple of things about some of the features in EduBrite, which might be helpful in building effective assessments, so that you can be aware of some of the things other than what Brian already described as the key criteria, like the distractors, the quality of distractors you can add or you shouldn't add. So few things I'm going to talk about is basically the role of visuals in the assessment is the first thing I would like to highlight. Is that it's always better nowadays to use some visuals in your assessments. Like you might use some images in the questions or choices, just so that people are not spending time in reading the text, rather they can be I mean, you're ultimately interested in doing their knowledge check or their learning check. So that's can be effectively done in shorter time by using some of these graphics or videos as a embedded asset within the questions. So that's one guideline we have. Besides the various question formats Brian already talked about, I'm going to just discuss one specific question format, which is Likert. And EduBrite has multiple variations of the Likert. So Likert questions are mostly seen in survey kind of scenario, but I'm going to just add that Likert questions are also very helpful in situational analysis type of assessments also, which is very commonly used in professional training, such as suppose you want to coach or train your customer service reps or sales reps, like, how do they handle a particular situation? Like, if a rep receives a phone call from a not so happy customer, how should they deal with it? So basically there will be multiple options to deal with that kind of situation, but a smart rep might pick the best way to deal with it versus maybe not so smart rep. So these kind of assessments can be built using the Likert questions, like in this case we are showing here. Let me just increase the browser size here. So there is a situation described here, and we have a video embedded also, just to show the situation in more easy to understand manner rather than reading the text all the time. You can have a situational video also embedded in the question text. And then there are 4 different options we have presented here and 2 sub questions. So what's the most effective way of dealing with the situation and least effective way? So this is kind of question is not only in the psychometric analysis or situational analysis, but they can also be used in a programming question or other technical questions also, where maybe someone may get the question's answer right, but it might not be the best answer. So you don't want to penalize them or not give them points, but you might not give them full points if they did not pick the best answer. That's the fundamental benefit of these Likert questions over the multiple choice or multiple response type questions. So like, here you are kind of going binary, all or none kind of thing, although in some multiple select question you may award partial points, but still Likert gives you a very, very open option. So in this case, for example, in EduBrite, when you create these Likert question, you have 4 different layout possibilities, like vertical grid, single response or single select, vertical grid with multiple select, similarly horizontal with single and horizontal with multiple. So these are the 2 different variants of horizontal and vertical layout. The only differences between vertical and horizontal is vertically you are basically laying out 2 sub questions. So essentially user has to answer 2 things, and in horizontal your questions are laid out horizontally and choices are laid out vertically. So in this case, user has to answer 4 different sub questions. So in a way, it is a related set of 4 questions here, and here related set of 2 questions. So very useful in these kind of situation, and we'll see how this question actually looks when you play it. So let me just quickly just demonstrate this particular question type here. When we straight away go to this particular question, you can see that now you have a situation described here and a video. Although the video is not the best choice here about the situation we are talking about, but just to highlight the point, you can have very well described video about a situation, or you may have a real call recording from a particular call center conversation, and then you use that as a training content for the call center reps training in future, and then they need to pick the best and least effective way of dealing with that particular situation based on the situation you have described. Similarly here, people who are familiar with a little bit about Java, so this is a Java question. So we are basically asking how to represent a particular data best described in Java, best mapped in Java, although you can use int, float, everything, but for a balance, big decimal is the best choice. So we can give 100% point if somebody selects this choice. And other choices may have some weighted score, but not the full score. So those are some of the things that you can set when you are creating these questions. So like each of these choices, you can say whether it's correct or incorrect. If you don't mark these checkboxes, it's basically considered as incorrect. But if it is correct, then you can specify a weight, like 100 will tell that the user will get 100% of this point, and the point on this particular question is 10, which will be divided into two sub questions here. So each of these columns will have 5 points, and if you selected this choice, you will get 5 out of 5. If you selected this choice, you will get 4 out of 5 because of the 80% weightage. So this is just another way of using Likert style question in a non-survey kind of situation. Another point I want to highlight here is the use of grouping when you are delivering your assessments. So if you look at, for example, this particular test attempt, you can see that we are seeing a navigation at the top, which is a section navigation. So in a assessment which has large number of questions, like say if you have assessment with say 100 questions which the user has to take, it's normally a good idea to give them a way to have some logical chunks in the form of sections. And then in each section, you can also set the time limit, how much time a user has in a particular section. So as you can see here, we have two clocks running, one for the overall assessment and another for the section. So user has very clear idea that, okay, although my test has 60 minutes, but in this section, I have only say 10 minutes. So these are some of the another ways you can consider when you are designing assessment, especially for certification. This might be very useful. Next point is tagging your questions with various metadata. So if let's say you are building assessment pool of say hundreds of questions or thousands of questions, it's good idea to tag those questions with different subjects so that you can derive a report on the subject basis. So for example, in this particular test, we have 10 questions, but each of these 10 questions may be associated with a different subject, which is what we have done here. So for example, the first question is related to this first subject. Third question is also first subject, but the next one should be the second one, like second checkbox is checked. So if you're using EduBrite, you can define your metadata taxonomy for the entire site. And then when you're building assessment, you can tag your questions with these subjects. And this will help you get subject-wise report of the assessment out when the user completes the test. So this is very useful. Now, the next part which Brian talked about was the assessment objective. So that's the next thing I'm going to show here. So we saw section-wise grouping, then we also saw subject-based tagging. The another way to get some, these assessment produce an effective result or effective report of how a person performed in the assessment is using objective. So EduBrite lets you define these objectives, and on each objective you can set the scale, how much is the min and max score value possible. And then through the custom property tab, you can map each question to one of these objectives. So here, we have mapped certain questions to objective 1 and certain others to objective 2. So when the user finishes the test, you can see the report against each of those objectives. So let me just finish this particular test quickly so that we can see the output of the report. So as you can see, it is not letting me go into the first section because the first section is already timed out. So it will directly jump to the next section. Next section is also timed out. So it is now jumping to the third one. That's the kind of thing it's doing for me here. So let me just answer this one more question and finish it. I'm not going to pass this test because I did not answer all the questions. But here, all you can see is at the end, you can see the breakup of students' score against each section. You can see the time they took in each section. You can see their performance against each of the objectives. So that's on the second tab. Then you can see the performance against each subject based on the questions you have tagged. And of course, the individual question analysis is always there. So just to show the usefulness of tagging your questions with metadata, dividing your assessment in the chunks of questions in each section, you can get a lot of intel out of your assessment. And these intel can also be seen at an aggregate level, not just at an individual level. So looking at the clock here, we are almost towards the end. So I
Yeah,
will
so Ajay, we have
limit.
a couple of questions related to here. Maybe we can address right here.
Yeah, we can jump into the
Yeah.
Q&A.
So the questions which I'm seeing here is, one question is related to, is there a way to add a reading comprehension related question setup? Can that be done?
Yeah. So yeah, first let me describe what's the reading comprehension. I had it ready here. So basically, reading comprehension means that you may have a paragraph or a phrase in the assessment, and then you'll have some following questions which are related to this particular paragraph. So the learner will have to read this and then answer the following three questions, for example. So in EduBrite, you can create it using passages. So each of these phrase section is called passage. And then at the passage level, you can specify how many following questions are related to this particular passage.
Okay, another question is related to, what is the best practice showing the feedback on the fly or at the end?
Right. So I think Brian mentioned about the course quizzes or knowledge check kind of assessment versus the course exam or certification exam. So in general, anything that you are using in between the course after each learning material, generally people show the feedback immediately in those type of knowledge check quizzes. But if it is the end of the course exam or certification exam, then you would probably not show the instant feedback. You will show it at the end.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And then I have one more question I'm seeing here on the related to the assessment, that's related to the best practices, security in assessment. So how much we should worry about cheating or making sure that right folks are taking the right test or assessment?
Yeah, I think that's a very serious question. And the thing is, with so much focus on online education, that has become one of the talking point about what all can we deliver online, what kind of education or learning or certification can be delivered online. So based on the kind of use you are thinking, if it is a certification exam or a degree or diploma type of exam, I would say that like conduct in a proctored environment. So even if it is online, have it conducted in a proctored environment. EduBrite does have support for online proctored test, but to a limited level. There are other products which provide and other companies which provide more of an infrastructural based proctoring, like you may have exam room where you need to go and conduct the exam, or they might have some camera and other things. EduBrite has a soft proctoring implementation where a proctor has to unlock the test using their password, then only the learner is allowed to take the test. So those kind of things you can still do using a system which supports some level of proctoring. So that's one part. And second part is you should always look for at least having a security where while taking the test, the system does not allow concurrent access from two places or two browsers. So that it's not that 10 different users are actually logged in from 10 different places and they're actually taking tests for one person. So those things should be something which you should guard against in whatever system you're using.
Okay, great. That's the end of the questions here from the audience. We can move on to the conclusion slide, and we'll give another 30 to 90 seconds if any other question comes. Otherwise, we'll be concluding the webinar. So we can go to the quickly conclusion slide here.
Yep. So I think Brian has already covered these two parts. So like all the considerations you need to have when you are building the assessment, because your assessment writing style, question writing style has a lot of influence on the effectiveness of it. Similarly, think about the right type of question which are going to help you in getting the reporting out of the system, both for an individual student as well as at the aggregate level. And then there are certain limitations. In the previous webinar we had discussed about how much reporting can a LMS provide out of a SCORM based assessment. In general, they might have a little bit more leverage on assessments which are natively created within the LMS. So those are a couple of things which you should keep in mind.
All right, great. I think we have one more question, but I think that's already covered. That's related to creating these quizzes in the authoring tool versus LMS. So that depends on you have both options available. If you're using some authoring tool, you have an option which Brian has shown, you can do it. Or most of the LMS do have some sort of a capability. So you may want to check the LMS you are using, that what kind of a question types natively they provide. So we potentially could have both options. So with this, we are almost to the end here. So I have just a quick slide. So if you have any other questions, feel free to post them into the users community. And these are some mechanisms you can stay connected with us. So EduBrite University is always your best resource to connect with us and finding all the resources available there. You can also subscribe to our blog so you would be fully up to date with all the expert articles which we are sharing with the learning and development community. And we also have a lot of upcoming webinars that are planned. So Brian, if you can pull out so this is kind of a list of some upcoming webinars. So you can see, depending upon your interest, we are conducting a lot of webinars which are basically very, very useful for instructional designer, LMS administrator, team leaders, or those people who are working in this industry, or sometimes some of the webinars a little bit more industry specific. So if you are trying to build, working in high-tech industry and trying to create some certification program, or if you want to build effective online classroom training, or if you are a startup looking to set up ways to start the university program, you have not embarked on that journey. So we have a lot of great webinars that are in a pipeline. So feel free to join and you can find all this information on our Twitter also. At Twitter handle it at EduBrite. So we look forward connecting with you in the future webinar. Thank you very much for joining today. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Ajay.
All right. Thank you all for joining.